Welcome to the 10th day of the Azure Advent Calendar. Today we'll get to dive into Azure Blueprints and how you can go about managing them as code. My name is Wesley and I'm going to share some of my recent Azure Blueprints experiences with you. I've been blogging about this subject for quite some time, and all the content we're going through during this video will be summarized in a blog post with additional links, including samples and use cases. The goals for today are pretty straightforward. We're going to create and assign an Azure Blueprint using the Azure portal. We'll call this Design First. Additionally, we'll look into creating and assigning Azure Blueprints using a code-first approach. And finally, we'll take a look at assignment files and how you can use them to scale your Azure Blueprints deployments. It is recommended that you have somewhat of a basic understanding of Azure Blueprints. I will briefly touch the basics during this video, but if you're getting into Azure Blueprints as code, understanding the basics is trivial, and I will have some links for guidance in the blog post that comes with this video. Additionally, you will need the AZ Blueprint PowerShell module, and an understanding of JSON really helps. We're not going to write it from scratch because really nobody wants to do that, but being able to read it will get you a long way. Let's briefly look at the basics of Azure Blueprints. Azure Blueprints allow you to define a repeatable set of Azure resources, much like ARM templates. But Blueprints can do much more. They allow you to package different types of resources, orchestrate the deployment, and add lifecycle management. Azure Blueprints are built of artifacts. Artifacts can be role assignments, policy assignments, ARM templates, or resource groups. Together, these artifacts form an Azure Blueprint, one package that can be deployed to one or multiple subscriptions. Blueprints can be stored on a management group level, making them accessible to all subscriptions within that management group, or on the subscription level, making them only accessible to that specific subscription. Let's see how this works in practice and create, publish, and assign a blueprint. We're going to use the Azure portal and navigate to the Azure Blueprints page. On the left, we can see multiple options. We can inspect existing blueprint definitions and see whether they are assigned or not. For now, we'll go with the option to create an Azure Blueprint as provided through the Getting Started menu. We now have the option to go with one of the many pre-existing samples or build our very own blueprint. And we're going with that option, the option of creating our own blueprint from scratch. We're now presented with some input fields, starting with the name. Let's go with My First Blueprint. Next, we need to store the blueprint. We'll store it on a subscription level, but remember, you can also store the blueprint on a management group level. Next, we'll take a look at the artifacts. Right now, the blueprint is still empty and we need to add an artifact. For simplicity, let's go with a single artifact. As you can see, we can create the different types of artifacts, but let's go with a policy assignment. You can choose any of the policies that exist within your subscription, but let's use a pretty straightforward policy that audits whether web apps are configured with HTTPS. We add the artifact and can choose to edit it if we please. For example, we can configure whether the policy effect is set to audit or disabled, or if we want to hardcode the parameter value into the artifact itself. We're then going to save the draft and create our very first blueprint definition and store it on a subscription level. We're being redirected back to the original blueprint screen, and if we go to blueprint definitions, we will see that our blueprint is stored as a draft but not yet published or assigned. Let's navigate back to the blueprint definitions and open our newly created blueprint. On the top left, we can see that we have the option to publish our blueprint. We can give it a version and we'll go with 0.1. We choose to publish, and once the blueprint is published, we can see that we now have the option to assign the blueprint. Assigning the blueprint requires you to input some parameters. We need an assignment name, a location for the deployment, and we'll go with West Europe for this. And as this is our initial blueprint, we don't have many versions to choose from. We can scroll down and see that we can input some specific parameters like the policy effect, but we'll leave it at audit and then choose to assign the blueprint. The assignment is being created and we now have to wait for it to complete. Depending on the size of your blueprint and the amount of artifacts, this usually should only take a few seconds to complete. But the Azure portal will inform you once it's done, and then you have the option to go back to the blueprint window and look for the assigned blueprints. And as you can see, the blueprint is now assigned and has a state of deploying. And as we're only deploying a single artifact, the deployment has already completed as indicated by the green bar stating assignment succeeded. Our policy has now been successfully assigned. So what just happened? We went through the blueprint process, we've created the blueprint using the Azure portal, we published it, and then we assigned the blueprint which deployed our policy. Before we move on to actually managing blueprints as code, it is important to take a step back and look at the blueprint process. The first step is to create a blueprint draft. This is where you configure your artifacts, and you can then save the draft and choose to edit it at a later point in time. The next step is to publish the blueprint. Once you publish the blueprint, you assign a version and you're pretty much saying, hey, I might just deploy this. Then the last step is to assign the blueprint and actually deploy the resources as defined within the artifacts. This is what we just done in the previous Azure portal exercise. Let's move on and try to do this using the AZ Blueprint PowerShell module and look at it from an infrastructure as code perspective. Because we don't want to write the blueprint definition from scratch, we will use PowerShell to look up the blueprint we just created. We can do this using the get AZ Blueprint command and pass the name as a parameter. We then store the blueprint in a variable BP for later use. We can now use the export AZ Blueprint with artifact command to export a blueprint we just built using the Azure portal. We pass the blueprint object we just created and decide on an output path. We'll go with the current directory. Once the blueprint is exported, we can see that a new directory, My First Blueprints, is created. If we navigate into that directory, we can see that the blueprint.json and the artifact directory are there. Let's take a deeper look. Using the Explorer, we can see the files we just exported. We can navigate into the artifacts directory and we see that there is one artifact present. The next step is to inspect these files using Visual Studio Code. The contents of blueprint.json look familiar and the artifacts contain the policy that audits whether HTTPS is configured for web apps. Before we move on, let's take a step back and look at the blueprint artifacts. From the Azure portal, they seem pretty straightforward, but when looking at the JSON representation, they can be quite overwhelming. A blueprint artifact looks similar to your regular ARM template. However, in the world of blueprints, ARM templates, policy assignments, and role assignments are actually a property of an artifact. In this example, we're creating an artifact that deploys an ARM template. The artifact is of kind template and accepts one or more parameters. These parameters can be parsed to the actual ARM template. Keep in mind that these parameters also have to be present in the blueprint.json, but more on this later. The template goes inside the artifact, and 99% of the time you can just copy and paste your ARM template into the artifact. The end result would look something similar to this. As you can copy and paste your ARM templates into a blueprint artifact, you have to make sure that the parameters match. Long story short, you define a parameter in your ARM template, you define it in your artifact, and last but not least, you define it in your blueprint.json. Before we can deploy our blueprint using infrastructure as code, we need to create an assignment file. And this is where things get a little complicated. The assignment file contains the actual values of the parameters required by blueprint.json. The assignment file is written in plain JSON and requires some knowledge to get started with. Using Visual Studio Code, let's create a new file called assignmentfile.json. And I'm copy and pasting the required contents, but a copy of the assignment file that I just used is also posted in the blog that comes with this video. But as you can see, the values match with what we just entered in the Azure portal earlier. And if we take a look at the parameter for the policy effect, we can see that it is set to audit. That means that the blueprint.json should accept a parameter with an identical name and also accepts the value of audit. While we're at it, let's rename the name of our policy artifact for something that actually makes sense. And as long as it's stored within the artifacts directory, it will work just fine when deploying the Azure Blueprint. Once we've got that sorted, we can go back to PowerShell and see if we can deploy this newly created blueprint. We're back in PowerShell and we can see that our assignment file is there. Using import AZ blueprint with artifact, we can name our new blueprint and import the files from the current directory. And as you can see, we're still working with that initial blueprint we just exported from the Azure portal earlier. Importing the blueprint will just take a few seconds, but once that's done, we will have to create a new variable that will hold our blueprint object. We do that just as if we were getting our initial blueprint earlier, and once that's stored, we can go on to publishing the blueprint. We can publish the blueprint using publish AZ blueprint and do the versioning just as if we did it through the Azure portal. It just takes the version and the blueprint object, and once the command is run successfully, we can actually start assigning the blueprint. Before we assign the blueprint, let's take a look at the workflow and see what's happening when you do this. We've already talked about parameters, but if your assignment is unsuccessful and you need to figure out what's happening, this is probably something you want to understand. We're starting with the assignment file on the top left. This is where we store the values of our parameters. These values are then passed to the blueprint.json. When artifacts are deployed, their parameters will have the value of whatever the blueprint.json provides them with. The template within the artifact will then accept the values from the artifact itself. This is where clear and good naming convention comes in. To clarify, the parameters within the ARM template can have different names, but the parameter names of the blueprint.json and the artifact itself must match. Let's go back to PowerShell and see if we can get that assignment working. We're running the command new AZ blueprint assignment, and we're giving our assignment a name, just as if we would by using the Azure portal. We're also passing our blueprint object and use the assignment file we just created. Once the command is done executing, it will show you that it actually has a provisioning state of creating, and we can move on to the Azure portal and see if the assignment is actually deploying. And after inspecting our assignment through the Azure portal, we can see that the assignment succeeded. It deployed the policy we configured. And if we actually go to Azure policy, we can inspect if the policy is actually assigned and active. And as you can see, it is. So let's summarize what just happened. We've exported the blueprint using export AZ blueprint with artifact. We then added an assignment file, created the draft, and published the blueprint using publish AZ blueprint. Using the assignment file we created, we ran new AZ blueprint assignment and verified through the Azure portal that our deployment actually succeeded. Let's do a brief wrap up before we end this video. Getting started with blueprints as code does not require a lot of effort, but there is somewhat of a learning curve when you're looking at blueprints that contain multiple resources. Assignment files can turn into pretty lengthy files, but keep in mind that this is the only place that you should store your parameter values. You can find more details, samples and use cases in the blog post, and I hope you enjoyed it and thank you for watching.